Hello, and welcome to this episode of In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness, the Odyssey, Episode 3 Conclusion. Last episode, I completed my analysis of Odysseus and his conflicts with Poseidon while also analyzing Odysseus's pride. This episode, I will present my concluding analyses of the Odyssey. One only has a complete experience of Homer when reading both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer teaches us through the Iliad and the Odyssey together the impact of war on civilizations, whether they are the object of war or on its periphery. Homer teaches us that this pattern of war is driven on by mankind's attempt to seize apotheosis on its own terms, eerily echoing original sin in Genesis when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil because they were promised they would be as gods if they did so. Not only are we taught the philosophy of war, we are also taught the pattern of war that becomes repeated throughout history, but at greater and more tragic magnitude. Homer also teaches us a very cynical understanding of the Greek gods. The gods of Homer, as seen in the Iliad episodes, behave more like demons than true transcendent deities. This is an insight that St. Augustine makes in City of God, his great work. Plato's Socrates takes offense at the gods of Homer. As we shall see in Plato's great work that I will begin to cover next, Plato's Republic, Socrates calls for the banning of parts of Homer, or even all of it is necessary. In his fictional ideal state, spoken of in Republic, on the grounds that Homer's gods are simply embodiments of subjective truth and thus harbingers of evil. Homer imparts to us an understanding of the world that sees life as humans living in isolation, where even the lowliest and worst off existence in this world is to be preferred versus being a mindless shade in Hades, the Greek underworld, which is the destiny of most people, unless you just so happen to be like Menelaus and the gods just so happen to favor you highly. There is, in short, nothing meritorious in virtue, nor in suffering for the sake of virtue. The grounds for Socrates wanting to censor Homer lay in the impression this would have on the younger generations, who would in all probability strive to exemplify the examples put before them, or, if not that extreme, then to prevent a massive misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the goodness and transcendence of divinity that would shape everyday attitudes towards divinity as simply nothing more than embodiments of subjective truth. Another cross reference I would like to make concerns something I found striking in Homer. That is, Homer has the tendency to give so much detail and the background story of so many characters, a good number of which contribute nothing or very little to the story, or may even be killed off in the next paragraph. This style of writing can, at times, seem a major distraction to the overall plot, and one might even wish that Homer would get to the point. Yet to take this attitude would be to miss the point of why Homer does this. To illustrate, I will make a quick digression and embark on a comparison with accounts from Genesis. This diversion to Scripture is not meant to distract from Homer's works, but to ground Homer's philosophy with the philosophy put forward by other classical texts. By this way of comparing Homer's understanding of the world with other authors' understanding of the world put forward in other written works, we can perceive not just diverse ways of thinking, but strands of unity that bind together all experiences of mankind across history and geography, time and space. A surface level comparison seems to draw no similarities, If we, for example, read through the creation account of Genesis, we find that God creates everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And yet, a careful reading of the creation account tells us that the sun was created on the fourth day. The significance of this may not at first be obvious, but if we think deeper, we reach the conclusion that the previous 3 days of creation, in all logic, cannot have been 24-hour solar days, as the sun was not created until the fourth day. This insight opens up the possibility that the 7 days of creation are, on one level, a poetic device meant to communicate a deeper and otherwise unfathomable truth. Yet Scripture is silent on the specific details of these 7 days otherwise. However, whether this be a deliberate omission or not, because perhaps it would be too much detail. If too much detail is given, we might miss the point of the creation accounts, which are meant to tell us, on one level, that the first principles of the universe, or rather, the first principle of the universe, is divine reason and not random chance. If the reader reads a bit further of Genesis, we encounter Melchizedek. We are told nothing about Melchizedek. We're not told who his parents are, where he comes from, how he came to be king of Salem, and what his relationship to God is. Melchizedek pops into the story of Abraham and pops out just as quickly. Yet this obscurity makes Melchizedek a perfect prefigurement for Christ. The latter being, as St. John's Gospel tells us, there in the beginning with the Father, a detail Genesis does not give us, but St. John's Gospel does. This seeing Melchizedek as a prefigurement for Christ is something drawn out in the letter to the Hebrews, and even helps explicate how Christ is the high priest of the new covenant, and how Christ further fulfills the Levitical priesthood Mosaic law in the Old Covenant. In these interconnected details, Christ is set up as the center of both Old and New Testaments and binds together in unity both testaments. This unity, though, is established through the obscurity of Melchizedek. Just cross-reference the letter to the Hebrews for more details, which I will eventually go over in the far future when I get to Genesis and Hebrews. A last example can be found in the event of God telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. We know, or we can presume to conclude, that Abraham did not want to do this, as any good father would not want to sacrifice their children, especially an only miracle child. We can presume Isaac was not too crazy about this, but still was moved by faith in God to go through with the sacrifice. But this is never explicitly stated. Scripture does not tell us, for the most part, how Abraham and Isaac felt before, during, or after this event. Yet, had more details been given, the lesson we are meant to pay attention to would be obscured. The lesson of faith, that is, that Abraham was willing to give everything he was given from God back to God, because Abraham and Isaac believed in a God that would make everything right in the end. This lesson in faith and divine justice may have been lost or obscured, at the very least, had more details been given than necessary. Going back to Homer, the detail is how the focus of Homer's story is made plain, as much as how the lack of detail helps bring the center of the story of Genesis into plain view. That is, for sacred scripture, God is the main character and actor and initiator of all that unfolds in and outside the confines of the Bible. The Bible becomes the written, divinely inspired memory of God's actions in and outside history. For Homer, it is the stories of plain and everyday folk that place these very plain and everyday folk at the center of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey are stories about war and how the lives of families are torn asunder by the attempt at apotheosis through the hubris of mankind in war. It is this attempt at apotheosis that leaves the stain of blood on the earth crying out for justice, which is also another theme we see in Genesis, interestingly enough. It is this very hubris that levels prosperous civilizations, creates widows, sees brothers and husbands murdered, babies killed, parents heartbroken, and presents people with the temptation to connive their way to the top of a political hierarchy that is empty at the top because of war. This last aspect is the very center and story of the Odyssey, and what the suitors were truly trying to do, and what makes the suitors the villains of the Odyssey. It is for this reason that the Odyssey completes the story of the Iliad. This is also why the message of the Iliad and the Odyssey are still just as relevant today as when they were written over 2,000 years ago. Though my original question remains, what is the path to human happiness? Perhaps the very ending of the Odyssey answers this. At the very end of the Odyssey, Odysseus is on the verge of massacring Ithaca's people for the part they played in tacitly, or in some cases overtly, supporting the suitors. However, Athena intervenes and brokers a communion of peace between Odysseus and his people, leaving our tragic story of the Iliad and the Odyssey on a hopeful note. The lesson is clear. Although Homer's gods are responsible for the conflicts we saw in both stories, it seems to be that only divinity retains the power to end this tragic cycle and chaos of human conflict, violence, and war. Homer might believe the gods to be embodiments of subjective truth, but does the ending of the Odyssey, as with the characters of Priam and Hector, speak to Homer's hope that the gods are actually good and transcendent, and that they are the ones who will bring peace to the chaos of the human condition, and that virtue and suffering for virtue is meritorious in and of itself? Perhaps, but one can only speculate. For my part, I cannot reach any other conclusion than this, as this is what ends the great works of Homer. For Homer, it seems the human condition, due to its flaws and limitations, cannot bring itself the happiness and truth it wants, but must depend on divinity for what we naturally want and cannot give to ourselves. Although, from Homer's perspective, we can definitely see how divinity is still understood to be a mixture of good and evil, or rather, if we must say that they're a mixture of good and evil, maybe we must conclude that they are all evil. But if they are all evil, we must bring up what it means to truly exist. For existence, if it is good, then we must understand what evil is. Although this is a question we must put aside for another time. For my part here, this concludes my coverage of the Odyssey and the works of Homer. On the next episode, I will begin to cover Plato's great works, and I will begin with Republic. Thank you for listening to this episode of In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness.